Welcome to F106, Fielding and Integrating Capabilities. This is the 6th lesson of F100 Force Management. You may not be familiar with the term force integration, but most of you will have some experience in units that have gone through the force generation cycles. Here is our top 5 takeaway slide, highlighting the major focus areas of this lesson. I will talk about how force integration synchronizes .mil-PF solutions into organizational designs. We will learn about the ERPL and the DARPL. We will examine the roles performed by the Army G3 and G1 when it comes to manning. We will look at equipment distribution and redistribution, and also examine the Army's rearm process. So the intent of this slide is to show how the .mil-PF domains fit into the greater force management process and model. Force integration ensures all the actions being developed in all domains come together in time and space at an installation, motor pool, or facility to change or create a unit. This begins with assessing .mil-PF solutions. Then, as the process moves along, the headquarters DAG357 FM Directorate uses force integration functional area analysis areas to ensure synchronization from the Department of the Army perspective. Headquarters DA evaluates all proposed organizational changes by using a FIFA analysis to ensure designs are suitable, feasible, and acceptable. In this case, suitable means the proposed organizational design must accomplish the Army's mission and comply with Chief of Staff for the Army guidance. Feasible means the proposed organizational design, unit, branch, and echelon must have the capability to accomplish the mission in terms of available resources. Acceptable means the transformational advantage gained by executing the organizational design must justify the increased cost in resources. This slide identifies some of the actions within the .mil-PF domains that must be synchronized in time and space to build a capability at an installation. The bottom of this slide shows how PPBE is related to force integration. Throughout the process, leaders must exercise stewardship and ethical application of technical knowledge to ensure the right capabilities are developed to maintain the trust of Congress and the American people. So take a moment to consider who the lead agencies are for the .mil-PF domains in the table on this slide. And we may talk about this in class a little bit. So, force integration is intended to improve warfighting capabilities with minimum adverse effect on readiness during the period of transition. It is hard for the Army to incorporate change while keeping units and organizations at the highest readiness levels to meet the demands and requirements given to it. It is imperative that the Army looks at how it can implement change to the force as seamlessly as possible to retain readiness. So why do we care about turbulence in organizations? Think about the impact of adding or subtracting personnel and MTOs every year, or adding new equipment on which soldiers must now train. What is meant by instant unreadiness? Consider the implications of modernizing or replacing legacy combat systems with new ones. How do we meet the need for modernization while remaining focused on our wartime missions? All of these factors must be considered when thinking about how the Army prioritizes resources to meet our operational demands. This slide provides an overview of the process the Army uses to prioritize finite resources for distribution to operational units. Joint Force Prioritization documents include the Joint Staff's Defense Planning Guidance, DPG, and Contingency Planning Guidance, which you might remember from your C200 classes. The DPG and CPG now include information that was formerly issued in the Global Employment of the Force, or GEF, which is no longer produced. Defense Planning Guidance, this is a classified document, is focused on force development. It provides direction to the services on what capabilities to prioritize, as well as guidance to the combatant commands on which services will own which bases in their AOR, and guidance to the planning community on resource prioritization in terms of budget, personnel, etc. There are 3 documents used to communicate Army priorities. The G357 is responsible for integrating and synchronizing Army priorities. The Integrated Resource Priority List, or IRPL, prioritizes requirements and initiatives for the Department of Defense, Joint Staff, and Army Enterprise into 3 categories. The IRPL also synchronizes resources with requirements in the year of execution as well as over the Program Objective Memorandum period. The Dynamic Army Resourcing Priority List, or DARPL, is both a classified and an unclassified document. Programmers primarily use the unclassified version, which removes the qualitative data for use in resourcing applications. Anyway, it ranks Army units at the UIC, or alpha level in a 1 to N list and aligns them with IRPL categories in priority order to focus resourcing strategies. The DARPL serves as the established order of precedence approved by the senior Army leadership that guides the distribution of resources. The Active Component Manning Guidance prioritizes and aligns active component manning with synchronized Army priorities. It has 4 categories: ASL directed category A, B, and C, which are aligned with the IRPL and represent DARPL priority. The Army fills units to the highest level possible based on the Army's distributable inventory and as directed by senior leaders. The G357 is the approval authority, and the headquarters DAG1 is the proponent. Let's take a look at manning the Army. Okay, the big takeaway here is that you understand the difference between manpower management and personnel management. You also might want to understand the purpose of the Army Component Manning Guidance. So, the Army G1 takes authorizations from FMS and force structure from SAMUS, it's not shown here, to determine the Active Component Manning Guidance, which outlines the Army priorities for that fiscal year. From the Army Manning Guidance, HRC takes this guidance and then fills the faces into the right spaces, as directed by the G1. The G1 manages the faces and the manning of the Army. The G357 manages the spaces and organization of the Army. The two work very closely together to make sure personnel policies support required force structure. The Army projects its strength requirements and attains personnel authorizations to meet those requirements through TAA. This process is referred to as manpower management, which links accession, retention, and promotion targets to Army requirements. Manpower management, which manages personnel authorizations, or commonly referred to as spaces, is a G3 function. Personnel management is a G1 function. It deals with the actual soldiers, commonly referred to as faces, and it assigns them to fill authorizations in an approved Army force structure. It is important to differentiate between these two terms specifically because there are not enough personnel faces to fill all authorizations, the spaces. Let's go back to the question I asked on the previous slide. What is the purpose of the active component manning guidance? The purpose is to establish active component manning priorities, manning goals, and responsibilities at all levels. The Army G1 is responsible for formulating, coordinating, publishing, and overseeing the active component manning guidance based on guidance from the Chief of Staff of the Army. The G357 also plays an important role by providing HRC with visibility of key events and ERPL/DARPL priorities. HRC is charged with implementing the active component manning guidance while concurrently attempting to balance the professional development needs of soldiers and the personal needs of soldiers and families. The bottom line is that the active component manning guidance helps the Army manage personnel to spread out the shortages and their risks. So the purpose of this slide is to show how the active component manning guidance is connected to the DARPL and that it is not static. Both of these documents change as priorities change for the Army. The charts show the 4 different active component manning guidance categories. These categories change along with the aggregate manning levels percentage based on Army priorities which are created by the demands against the Army from the Chief of Staff of the Army and the DARPL. If the inventory allows, units will be manned in accordance with their required Table of Distribution and Allowances, TDA, or Table of Organization and Equipment, or TOE. So how does HRC assign faces to spaces? This slide shows the balance that HRC must make when assigning officers. HRC must consider Army requirements in the green sections. These requirements are based on MTOs and TDAs. The blue triangle is the balance for the officer: education, key developmental or qualifying time, broadening assignments, and any special circumstances such as EFMP. There are currently 2 manning cycles per year. The HRC Officer Professional Management Division uses 2 windows or cycles a year to move officers. The summer cycle is the largest. Once a shortage is identified by a unit in accordance with commander priorities, a requisition must be built by the officer strength manager of that unit or organization in coordination with HRC Force Distribution Branch. HRC will then validate this requisition at a manning conference. If this requisition is not validated at the manning conference, it will not be filled. Many times, valid shortages are not filled, mainly due to unit priorities. The assignment process for officers is a 2-pronged process. The Unit S1 feeds data to Command S1s, and each command has an account manager at HRC. Account managers work with commands and major units to determine which openings are priority and need to be validated based on Army manning guidance. The assignment officer manages the population of officers by MOS and grade. The assignment officer identifies the available population for each cycle. At a manning conference, the assignment officers meet with the account managers for the commands and adjudicate how many openings will be validated based on available population for each branch and grade. Officers are not placed against positions at the manning conference. They simply determine the population versus the requirements numbers. Once the number of requisitions for each command are validated, the assignment officers begin to match available officers to open positions by name based off of data from AIM 2. AIM-2 uses a market vision concept to find the right officer for the right job at the right time. The goal is to match officer talents to unit requirements during the assignment cycle. We just talked about manning. Now we will shift focus to equipping. Where and when do you think equipping starts? Consider our journey through the Army Force Management model so far. Force integration exists throughout force management in the development of materiel and eventual equipping of units. Once a unit signs for equipment, the equipment enters the operations and support phase of the defense acquisition system. From a receiving unit perspective, force integration begins at this point and ends after unit new equipment training or unit training is complete. Integrated process teams are used to discuss and seek solutions to implement challenges of force management initiatives. These cross-functional working groups work complex issues faced by the accelerated pace of change in a manner superior to the linear and sequential methods used in the past. Headquarters DA continues to use the team approach for force management. The three key staff officers that chair the major integrating working groups are the Requirements Staff Officer, or RSO, assigned to the G8, the Synchronization Staff Officer, SSO, assigned to the G8 as well, and the Department of the Army System Coordinator, assigned to the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. They work with the other team members, including the G357 Force Integrator, the G357 Organizational Integrator, the G8 Program Analysis and Evaluation Action Officer, the Document Integrators, the Personnel System Staff Officer, Command Managers, and Resource Integrators. As required, representatives from ACOMs, ASCCs, DRUs, reserve components, and other functional area and special interest representatives are included in IPTs and the staffing of related force management issues. As with personnel, the Army does not always have sufficient quantities of equipment to fill all required authorizations. Therefore, the Army must prioritize how it modernizes and integrates equipment into operational units. The foundational guidance for how the Army prioritizes its equipment is provided in the National Strategic Documents and the Army Plan. The Army G8 and ASALT provide more refined guidance through the Army Modernization Strategy and the Army Modernization Guidance, which is published annually as an annex to the Army Planning Guidance, APG, document as part of the Army Plan. The Army Posture Statement is the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army's written testimony to Congress, which explains how the budget supports the Army priorities. The CSA designated Army Materiel Command in 2011 as the lead material integrator, or LMI, responsible for all Army new equipment distribution and redistribution. AMC's subordinate command, Army Sustainment Command, is the executive agent for AMC. ASC utilizes the unclassified, web-based collaborative decision support tool software program to lead Army materiel stakeholders through the planning and execution of Army materiel redistribution and distribution. The DST is the authoritative Army equipment on-hand common operating picture to visualize the equipping status of Army units and to make recommended actions to fill equipment shortages. The DST pulls data from the Logistics Information Warehouse, or LIW, LIW receives data from sources such as the Global Combat Support System Army, Army Equipping Enterprise System, and various force management systems. DST uses LIW data and other factors such as unit MTO, TDA, and future authorizations, equipment readiness codes, the DARPL, equipment due in to the unit, and others to determine the best solutions to increase readiness as needed for the Army. The Army G8 retains Army staff responsibility to plan and program for materiel and retains responsibility for component-level allocations of new and recapitalized equipment. Okay. Once the DST runs its computer-generated process, ASC vets the proposed sourcing actions with appropriate stakeholders before the action will be approved. If a unit has a LAD, mission, or is part of a known demand rotation, then the division or corps can coordinate at the installation level to redistribute equipment within their command to fill shortages for the deploying unit. This is called a Unit Equipment Reuse Working Group. The name of this working group may have changed or vary depending on the installation or command, but the intent behind it is still the same. The Army Modernization Equipping Conference, or AMEC, meets semi-annually to coordinate Army-level priorities and policy issues. At the end of the day, the goal is to fill unit shortages through the best possible means, which may include APS, total package filling, or an approved operational need statement. So, we've talked about manning and equipping. Now we will look at how units are managed in the new Regionally Aligned Readiness and Modernization Model, or REARM. REARM is a flexible, predictable force generation process that is regionally and functionally capable of supporting the national defense strategy. Two big takeaways here are that we moved to a division-based focus and brigades are deliberately cycled through a process that includes modernization. This slide will explain the operating construct or business rules of the REARM construct. Mission lines, that's simply a term to describe at least 3 or more units of the same size, type, and modernization level aligned against a known joint staff or Army requirement. Units are expected to remain in mission lines for multiple years. Formations aligned under a mission line will have the same assigned modernization level. Heel-to-toe, or no overlap, rotations are the optimal solution for competition requirements in order to maintain mission line cycles. Functionally and regionally aligns the total Army, active duty, National Guard, Army Reserve against current, in this case, FY22, Joint Staff and Army requirements. Units in this construct are aligned against competition requirements, but optimized for escalation through crisis to conflict. We'll talk more about how this process works in class. Here's an example of some of the activities that take place during each phase of REARM. The actions below are not inclusive of all the possible activities that a unit might experience. Here's just another way to look at force management and many of the activities that lead up to force integration. Ultimately, our goal is to have ready and available units as we build combat power for the combatant commander. This has been an overview of F106 force integration. Which of these takeaways is the most relevant to you as a field grade officer?